Hello everyone, and welcome to a video where we're going to talk about some of the questions that VCAA hasn't asked about yet, which is something you probably haven't thought about too much at all. I was originally going to do a video talking about the 2019 exam and the questions that were done most poorly, because often VCAA likes to ask about those things again. If that interests you at all, let me know, because I've got all the resources prepared for it, and then I just have to make it. So let me know about that, but we'll get into this. And I'm about to show you about why this is so important. But first up, before we do that, one thing that I always like to tell people, VCAA are jerks. So all you got to do to remember is just VCAA are trying, well, they're trying to give you marks, but also they're trying to prove who's the smartest, and you want that to be you, and they're going to try and trick you in some ways. So knowing what to predict from them is going to hopefully help you a lot. So the purpose of this, so economics had a study design change in 2017, and we're in the fourth year of this new study design, meaning that you have a plethora of past exam questions to practice with. Shout out to me for the word plethora, super smart. And I bet you've been focusing on them like crazy. You've probably done a bunch of past VCAA exams, noticing that similar questions come up a lot. But did you know there's a whole bunch of areas that VCAA hasn't asked about on an exam yet? You probably haven't thought about that. You've probably gotten to the point where you've finished your curriculum, you've done some summary notes, then you get into past exams and you start smashing past exam questions and getting better at those. But what's going to happen if you get to the exam and they ask about something that hasn't been on one of those past exams? You're probably going to freak out. And so it's good to kind of like think about what hasn't been on them, look at some trends in them, and then prepare yourself in that area. So some general advice is hopefully by now you have the VCE Economics Study Design printed out, laminated, plastered around your house, or if you're truly dedicated, tattooed to your body. And lots of students make a mistake of only focusing on the key knowledge and not really focusing on the key skills. And so they focus on this key knowledge over here, but the key skills is so important and you shouldn't ignore it at all. If you look at the key skills, it essentially tells you all the task words that VCAA will use for that content in an exam setting. So you can see like in area study 1, it's like construct and interpret supply and demand diagrams. So you know you're gonna have to draw them. Budgetary policy, it's like evaluate strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy. Well, that's clearly going to come up as an evaluate question. So then you're pretty sweet in that area. So we're going to look at a few examples of questions that haven't been asked yet. We're going to look at 4 of them because that tends to be the number that I like to do. Then there's heaps more. Like I shamelessly stole them from the CPAP study guide, and if you look at them, there's like, well, they say there's 28 of them, as you can see, like here and here. But honestly, like some of them are not great. The CPAP study guide is great, but some of these are just like, they're things that you say, well, they're not going to ask that, or they've asked very similar to that before, and you've just made it into one question instead of options. So there's plenty more we can do. We can potentially make up more, but if you like the way this goes, let me know and we can do that. Also, I'd recommend the last question. I've got some very important tips based on another thing that's come up in VCAA exams. So question 1, using an example to illustrate, describe how the government can use indirect taxes to address market failures. So this will probably be around a 3-mark question. 1 mark for describing indirect taxes, 1 mark for describing market failure. And you'd probably do that as part of your example, like often, it'd be like this corrects market failure, brackets, quickly define market failure, end brackets, and then get into the 1 mark for example of how indirect taxes are used to address that market failure. You've probably got heaps of different examples you could go with here. You could look at taxes on pollution. You could look at, honestly, cigarettes and tobacco. It's the easiest option. Let's get into a sample though. So sample answer for this. Indirect taxes are taxes which are placed on the sale of specific goods or services, most commonly on socially undesirable goods. These indirect taxes aim to limit the overconsumption of a socially undesirable good by increasing their price to the consumer. This addresses market failure, where the allocation of resources does not maximize living standards, by reallocating consumers' resources away from demerit goods towards more desirable consumption. An example of indirect taxes on socially undesirable goods would be the taxes placed on cigarettes, that should be placed on the sale of cigarettes, which aims to limit the consumption of cigarettes, which is a product which can reduce living standards and push demand towards more desirable goods and services. Probably should say cigarettes and tobacco products to be more specific and make it a better answer, but as you can see, it kind of does those things pretty specifically. But often It's kind of a thing that we looked at a little bit of what the government can do to address market failure, but not often specifically like this. And all the time people get really focused on, well, the government can like directly intervene, or they can provide subsidies for the production of merit goods, or they can provide some things themselves, like public education, public healthcare, etc. But asking a specific one like this is kind of interesting because it's a pretty simple answer, and it's a pretty like common sense type answer. But often when you combine two things that students aren't expecting, it really throws them off. So something like this isn't too difficult, but be prepared for things like this. They are tricky. Next up, explain why recent growth in underemployment has made the movement in unemployment statistics a less reliable indicator of spare capacity in labor markets. I chose this one because it's super relevant in 2020, as throughout 2020, unemployment has increased by 1.7%, while underemployment has increased by 3%. So as you can see there, unemployment has increased by less than underemployment. So underemployment's increased by more. This means that more people are working less hours than they prefer. So people are working under full-time hours. They might be working casually part-time when they want to be working full-time. This means that unemployment data is less reliable of an indicator of spare capacity, as an increased level of employed persons are working less hours than they desire. So a significantly more amount of people are working casually or part-time, as we said before. The sample question for this also had a section on how it would impact monetary policy settings. I feel like this is too much for one question. Not the VCAA might not do that, but there's a lot going on in that question already, asking about a lot of different things. So I cut it down just to make it more directly about the underemployment and unemployment side of it, because that's the skill that we're wanting to get into. If you know what's changing in unemployment, you probably can talk about how monetary policy would change based on that, because you know if it's moving away from the goal or the goal is not a reliable indicator, they're going to be more expansionary. So let's get into the mark breakdown. Probably a 4-mark question, 2 marks for describing how underemployment and the recent movements in underemployment have happened, and 2 marks for explaining why that may mean that unemployment stats are less accurate showings of our spare capacity in labor markets. So to get into our sample, the underemployment rate is a situation where workers are not being used to their full capacity. For example, a worker who desires to work full-time is only working 4 hours a week and therefore is considered employed. So that's our first mark. So there, a recent increase in underemployment rate by 3% in Australia to 11.4%, while unemployment has only increased to 1.7%, shows that a larger percentage of the labour market are working under their capacity. So that's the second mark for that. I dropped a lot of numbers there to sound smart. You probably don't need that much. You only need to know that it's increased by comparison. But whenever you know stats, include them. It makes you sound very smart. Therefore, although unemployment data may show that the unemployment rate has not moved too far away from the government's goal of 4.5 to 5%, there is far more spare capacity than the 6.9% unemployment rate would make it seem. And so that's showing that it's less reliable of an indicator. You probably say at the end there, therefore it's a less reliable indicator because of this. But that's really stating that because underemployment has increased more than the unemployment rate, there are more people who are not working to their full capacity. Therefore, we are not utilizing the labor force to their full potential, and therefore we can't be as productive as possible. If I was to write a question about this for an exam, I probably wouldn't go the monetary policy route that the CPAP book went. I'd probably go just for aggregate supply afterwards, because that's going to be the point to go to. If we're not utilizing our workers to their capacity, then we're probably not going to be as productive, and it may negatively impact our aggregate supply. All right, question number 3. We're going to look at describe how government subsidies might increase aggregate supply in the short term, but negatively impact it in the long term. I like this question because it really ties in with how subsidies should be taught, and the government's moved away from them in recent years due to the negative long-term impacts of them. We've seen the automotive industry move offshore because the government was giving them subsidies for years and they weren't getting any more productive, and they were getting really reliant on the government handouts. And at the moment, this would link in really well to JobKeeper wage subsidies and the zombie businesses it's created. So like in the short term, JobKeeper has kept businesses in business because the government's paid a really decent percentage of their wages. That's kept their costs down, it's kept those businesses operating. But the second those subsidies go away, those businesses are going to be less productive. And a lot of those businesses were less productive in the first place because they were getting these subsidies even though they weren't producing anywhere near as much. And they were relying on them. As soon as they go away, those businesses are gone. So let's get into the mark breakdown here. We have 3 marks. 1 mark for defining subsidies, 1 mark for the short-term positive impact, and 1 mark for long-term negative impact. Pretty simple. But the reason why I like this question is a lot of time, you might not get it as blatant as this saying describe short-term, long-term. You might get it as a discuss the impact of government subsidies, or you might get analyze the impact of government subsidies, and it might be a 4-mark question in that way. You'll be expected to do that extra long-term step, but most people will only look at the short-term. And so therefore having to look at both is a really important skill in those bigger mark questions. So let's get to the sample. Subsidies are a payment provided to businesses by the government to aid their production. In the short term, these payments decrease the cost of production for businesses and therefore allow businesses to be more able to increase production, therefore increasing aggregate supply. However, in the long term, businesses can become complacent and reliant on these subsidies and therefore reduce their productivity as they know the subsidies will continue to cover a percentage of their costs, which therefore negatively impacts aggregate supply as resources are not being allocated efficiently to maximize production. So this one's pretty simple. Saying what subsidies are, short term, long term, 1, 2, 3, could be a lot bigger. So it could be utilizing a recent contemporary example, therefore JobKeeper, etc. It could just, if it includes that, then you've got to go a little bit more in depth to link it to that policy and how it's going to have short-term, long-term impacts. But something that hasn't specifically been asked, you usually get the questions like, explain how one of these policies can impact aggregate supply, and it's like subsidies, research and development grants, education and training. A blatantly separate one like this could very much happen in 2020 based on how the study design for Area Study 2 of Unit 4 has been cut down, and you don't have welfare, immigration, tax reform, etc. It's more likely these questions can be asked separately rather than under one umbrella. So you should probably be ready for things to be asked individually like this. And lastly, the seasonally adjusted rate of economic growth for the December quarter of 2019 was negative 0.5%. Calculate the annualized rate of growth and outline the implications on the goal of low inflation. So I've included this because the annualized rate of inflation was included as a multiple choice question a few years back, and it was not handled well. And to be honest, not a lot of people were expecting it to be asked, which is probably why it was not handled that well. And I think for the next year, everyone was expecting it to come up and prepared for it really well, and then it didn't show up, and then it didn't show up again. And I think people will start to feel a bit complacent about it. And therefore, by being prepared for it, if VCAA tries to pull any sneaky tricks and put it back in there about either inflation or economic growth, you will be prepared. So annualized rates of anything are pretty easy. You just take the quarterly stat and multiply it by 4 to get the annualized figure. If you get a half yearly stat, times it by 2. It's pretty simple. You just make whatever percentage of a year it is into the value of 1 year. But if you never faced the word before, it'll throw you off, hence including it here. So to break this down, likely a 3 or 4 mark question, but we'll go 4 marks for the purpose of this. 1 mark for your correct calculation, so negative 0.5 times 4 equals negative 2. 2 marks for outlining how falling economic growth impacts aggregate demand, and then 1 mark for how decreased aggregate demand impacts the goal of low inflation. So if the seasonally adjusted rate of economic growth for the December quarter in 2019 was negative 0.5%, this would mean that the annualized rate of economic growth is negative 2%. A negative 2% rate of economic growth represents a shrinking of our overall production levels, and therefore businesses are likely downsizing and laying off labor resources to protect their profit margins. This is likely to negatively impact consumer confidence due to a reduction in employment and potential fears about future incomes, which would likely lead to greater levels of private savings and decreased private consumption spending. Key point here, whenever you're talking about aggregate demand, including those components of aggregate demand, really just steps your answer up and makes it really clear and step by step. This then decreases the overall level of aggregate demand, decreasing demand inflationary pressures, moving us further away from the goal of low inflation, for the general price levels to rise at 2 to 3% on average over time. So we've made that step by step, getting through it in not too bad of a way. And that's it for this, 4 questions that haven't come up before, that could come up before. If this was useful for you, if you like more of these, tell me. if you want to look at some of the questions that were done poorly on 2019 and 2018's exam, let me know and we can make something up over the next week or so. Other than that, always happy to help with any other questions. If you ever want any feedback on anything, like leave a comment or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you with that. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you next time. Goodbye.